The pair clash over council tax and NHS spending. The PM lashed out at Mr Coybyn's accusations that mental health trusts have less funding than before, accusing the Labour Party of chuntering. She said spending has actually increased to a record £11.6 billion, adding, "We are taking more steps to address the issue of mental health than the Labour government ever took when they were in power." The allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party were discussed at the very end, and Mrs May said, "There is no place for racial hatred, for hate crime, in our society." How PMQs played out. BBCTheresa May is set to face off with Jeremy Corbyn12.58, finally addressing the elephant in the room. Sir Peter Bottomley brings up anti-Semitism. Looking at Labour, Mrs May said, "There should be a very clear message from all of us in this House that there is no place for racial hatred, for hate crime, in our society. This should not be part of our society, whether it is Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. This is something we should all do our best to stand up against and eradicate from our society." 12.47. Responding to Liz Twist, Mrs May says the decision on the passport contract will not be made until after the recess. She said it was important to remember a final decision had not been announced, just a preferred bidder. 12.45. Responding to Zach Goldsmith, Mrs May says she has the greatest sympathy for John Warboy's victims. She welcomes the judgment on his sentence. Mrs May said, "I have the greatest sympathy, and I know sympathies of the House will be with those who were the victims of Warboys and what they have suffered as a result of horrific crimes, and I welcome the judgment today that has found in favor of the brave victims who brought this legal action. The court's findings to give rise to serious concerns, and it is right that my Right Honourable Justice Secretary will be making a statement today." 12.43. Joanna Cherry asked about a Syrian refugee at a school in her constituency who cannot go on school trips because he doesn't have the right documents. Mrs May says she will ask the Home Secretary to look into it. BBCTheresa May tackled Mr Corbyn on the NHS and council tax. 12.41. Caroline Spellman asks Mrs May to congratulate the organisers of an exhibition in the Commons about Yazidi women held as slaves. Mrs May says she wants to ensure the women are freed. 12.39. Kenneth Clark asks Mrs May to confirm there will be no hard border on the island of Ireland, and asks if Mrs May will seek a customs arrangement similar to the customs union. She said, "We are indeed committed, we have given that commitment. We gave it in the December joint report, and we gave it in the negotiating stage that was completed last week to ensure there is no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, also to ensure there is business as normal with Northern Ireland and that it can continue to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom and vice versa. We are working to ensure that we have trade that is tariff-free and as frictionless as possible. Trade with the EU isn't completely frictionless today, but we will ensure that trade is as frictionless as possible in the future. We've put forward the proposals and we have already started talks in detail with the European Commission." 12.37. Caroline Lucas asks about Cambridge Analytica. Mrs May says the revelations are concerning and people should feel confident about what happens to their data. 12.35. Mrs May announces that the government is giving the MOD £600 million for the MOD Dreadnought submarine programme. She says the UK will continue to spend 2% on defence. 12.33. Alan Brown asks how Mrs May feels about top Brexiteers, such as Boris Johnson, using immoral data mining tactics during the Leave campaign. She says the allegations were denied. 12.30. Craig McKinley asks about dental care in his constituency. Mrs May says NHS England will offer dental services when the practice he mentioned closes. 12.30. Mrs May is asked when she will stop hiding behind the DUP and let same-sex marriage go ahead in Northern Ireland. Mrs May says he needs to recognise the government's record in supporting LGBT rights. She says that it was Labour who made this matter a devolved matter. She says she hopes the government will be re-established in Ulster so this matter can be addressed. 12.28. Responding to DUP's Jim Shannon's question whether the Prime Minister will pledge her support to persecuted Christians around the world, Mrs May said, "Easter is the most important time in the Christian calendar. It is a time of new life and hope, and that message of Christ's resurrection and the cross and the resurrection to help to support Christian around the world. But he is absolutely right about the very real persecution that too many Christians face around the world. I was pleased to meet recently with Father Daniel from Erbil in Iraq about the persecution his congregations were suffering, and he presented me with a Bible that had been burned when a church had been set on fire, which is now at number 10 Downing Street. 12.27 The PM wishes everyone in Telford a happy Easter. She welcomes the investment in the hospital in the area. She says this shows how Tories are putting money into the NHS, hitting out at Labour for saying the NHS is in crisis. 12.26 Theresa May hits out at Ruth George and says any child in receipt of free school meals will not have them taken away. Theresa May said, "I hope she was not implying in her question that every child who receives a free school meal will have that taken away from them, because they will not. They will not." And she talks about changes that are happening next week. Yes, we will actually see pensioners getting a boost to their pension next week. Families, 31 million income taxpayers will get an income tax cut. And 2 million people living on the national minimum wage will get a pay rise. 12.24 Chris Phillip asks if last year's stamp duty cut and the extension of Help to Buy helped more people get a foot on the property ladder. Mrs May said promoting home ownership is a central part of her government's policy. She is pleased the number of first-time buyers has reached its highest for 11 years. She reminded the House that Labour voted against the cut in stamp duty. BBC PMQs, Ken Clark asked about the Northern Ireland border. 12.16 Sir Peter Heaton-Jones commends the Prime Minister for getting on with Brexit. He says we should respect the decision of Brexiteers and just get on with it. The Prime Minister agrees with him, and says it's a pity Labour keeps trying to frustrate Brexit rather than getting on with it. 12.13 Jeremy Corbyn says he hopes the PM will support Labour's digital bill to ensure adequate protection for young people. He mentions a letter from someone who waited months for treatment on the NHS. He says it is in crisis. He asks if Mrs May will commit to ring-fencing mental health services. She says the NHS will receive an extra £10 billion. She added, since November the Chancellor has announced an extra £10 billion which is going into our NHS in the next few years. 12.10 The Labour leader said mental health trusts have £105 million less funding than 6 years ago. Mrs May slams him and says actually spending has increased to a record £11.6 billion. She added, we are taking more steps to address the issue of mental health than the Labour government ever took when they were in power. She criticised Labour for chuntering. 12.07 Jeremy Corbyn asks why there are 5,000 fewer mental health nurses. Mrs May says the government is putting more money into mental health services, and 1,400 more people are accessing mental health services every day compared to when the Tories came into government. BBC This is the last PMQs before the Easter recess. 12.05 Jeremy Corbyn is up now. He says that it is Autism Awareness Week. He mentions 2 people who died while in care. Is Mrs May confident this will not happen again? Mrs May says she hopes lessons have been learnt and a report into Southern Health is due later this year. Jeremy Corbyn said, this week is Autism Awareness Week and I welcome the work of the National Autistic Society and others. I hope the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the families of Connor Sparrowhawk and Teresa Colvin for their dignity in campaigning for answers about the deaths of the loved ones at the answer of Southern Health. Last week the Health Service Ombudsman said too many patients suffered failings in mental health care involving violations of the most basic of human rights of patients. Theresa May replied, there have been very significant steps taken to raise awareness of autism and ensuring that there is support available for those who are on the autistic spectrum. The very sad deaths of Connor Sparrowhawk and Teresa Colvin raise very real questions. 12.04 Mike Wood from Dudley South asks the PM to reject Labour's calls to scrap the council tax referendum lock. She says his constituency pays some of the lowest council tax, the West Midlands. Theresa May said, people living in Conservative-led Dudley Council pay among the lowest council tax in the West Midlands, and since taking control from Labour, the council has reserved street cleaning cuts, scrapped their plans to charge for green waste collection, and maintained the weekly bin collection. 12.01 The Prime Minister begins by wishing everyone a happy Easter.